Hello, everybody. I'm Sean the Bookmaniac of BookTube Infamy, and I'm one of the co-hosts of this event. And this event is to launch the debut novel by James Morrison, entitled Gibbons, or One Bloody Thing After Another. James is a book buddy of mine. This is as close as we've ever come to meeting in person, but he's been a guest on my channel several times. And he and Dorian have been involved in a annual colloquy to discuss. It's really an elite discussion about the fiction of the Canadian writer Marian Engel. And if you know anything about Dorian, you won't be surprised that she's the author of his favorite work of fiction, Bear. And that's how this all got started 3 years ago. And we checked in again last year on another Marian Engel novel. And after that discussion had been recorded, we were just shooting the shit and chatting, and James's wife, Lisa, came on screen and said, "Hi, guys. Did James tell you he had a manuscript accepted for publication?" And my jaw dropped to the floor, and I think Dorian's did. And James looked like he wanted to disappear into a hole in the ground. I don't think he was quite ready to announce this to the world. And Dorian and I have been having a great time with this news ever since, and that's why we're all here tonight. So it's great to be involved in launching James's novel into the world. Just before I turn it over to other presenters, just a few housekeeping things. I think you'll see more on your screen if you have it turned to speaker view, but that's up to you. And if you yourself don't want to be seen on the screen, just turn your video off, and then you won't be seen. Nobody will see you unless except in the participants list. And I'm going to be strictly monitoring that you keep your audio turned off at all times, because then burps and so on aren't going to show up on the video. There's going to be a Q&A later, and so please type your questions at any point between now and then. Just type them into the Zoom chat, and I will be posing them to James. And I think that's all the housekeeping I need to do. And I'm now going to turn it over to James's illustrious publisher, Kim Paulsat of the Edmonton, Alberta, Canada publisher, Orbis Tertius. Kim, please take it away.
Hello. You can hear me, right? So we got the privilege of publishing James's debut novel, Gibbons. I met James online, probably 2018. We started the press in 2019. During COVID, James and I were talking, and he said he had a manuscript that was kind of just sitting there languishing, and I told him to send it over to me because I know he has impeccable taste in books. So I wanted to check out what was happening there, and read the first few chapters, told him it was great, sent it back to him for some revisions, and about 6 months later, you ended up with what we have here. I just, right off the bat, I read the first few chapters, and I told him he shouldn't dare change them because they were polished to me, so I knew he could, make the rest of the book look that way. And then because he's Caustic, the cover critic, he asked if he could do the layout and stuff for the books, which I normally do, and I told him to go for it, and he came up with this beautiful cover and all the pictures and everything. So see, I probably know more about James than his bio is gonna say.
Don't tell them that.
I don't need to stick to the bio. James, he loves his dogs, he loves his books, he loves his family, and he's a huge fan of literature just in general, I'd say. But yeah, you can add from his bio there, Sean.
I think you've covered it. I'm not sure about the order of priority for those things that he loves, but we'll leave that aside. He was born in Adelaide, Australia, on unceded Kaurna country, and lives there with his wife, daughter, and dogs. He has too many books, and he's known for his caustic Twitter postings as the caustic for critic. Great. So let's turn it over to the man of honor, James.
Thank you. Yes, it's really thrilling to be doing this, and as I say, to see so many people who I know I'm online, but I've never actually had any voice-to-voice, face-to-face contact with. It's really nice. So thank you. I'm just going to read the shortest chapter from the book, which I should add has a few French words in it, and being an Australian, I'm about to mangle them. So please bear with me. But it's the third chapter from the book, but all the chapters stand alone, so it shouldn't require any kind of context to make sense. And it's called The Bullet.
The Bullet. Imagine the bullet. Very slightly deformed at its base from the cordite explosion which propelled it from the barrel of the rifle. It goes upwards into the air at an acute angle from the vertical, initially moving at more than twice the speed of sound. Millions like it have been used over the last 4 years, most of them pounded into flesh or brick or wood or earth. But some, too, like this, have been sent heavenward with no lethal intent, in anger or boredom or, as in this case, celebration. The bullet rises rapidly. Despite the slight irregularity in shape imparted in its firing, it doesn't tumble, though it does rotate around its central axis from the rifling of the Lee-Enfield barrel that sent it on its way. It's a foggy late morning, the moisture adding to the resistance in the air, slowing the bullet until it breaks free of the fog layer and into clearer air, and the drag reduces. And the air, too, is vibrating from the sound of church bells, though not enough to unduly trouble the bullet's passage. But entropy is inexorable, and gravity, too, cannot be argued with, and the bullet loses speed as it climbs. It still climbs a long way, however. Though he's using a gun borrowed from an English friend, the man who fired it is American. He thinks in terms of feet and inches, but this is Paris, so let's be metric. The bullet rises to a height of a little under 2.5 kilometres, reaching its apex south-southwest of its starting point. The first flying humans, François Pilote de Rosier and François Laurent, Marquis of Arlanders, passed near here 135 years earlier, though they attained a mere 1/15th of the bullet's maximum height in their Montgolfier balloons. Of course, neither balloon nor bullet can compare with the elevations attained by the fighter planes which have scattered through French skies in the last few years, full of bullets of their own. But then, this isn't a competition. Imagine the fraction of a second when the bullet reaches its apex, when it hangs for an instant, immobile, when the pull of gravity has just extinguished the last of the velocity imparted by the gun fired by bugler First Class Gordon Harrison of Cincinnati. From this point you can see so much of Paris stretching out below, or you could if it weren't for the fog, which makes everything a patchwork of vague grey and blue and brown. The only thing you could clearly make out at this moment is the top of the Eiffel Tower, rising out of the fog to the northwest. The blurry green areas to your east and west, the Bois de Boulogne and the Bois de Vincennes, look from here to be seething under the fog. This is the effect of numerous people congregating to celebrate in the open air. But ignore these larger open spaces, because from our imagined viewpoint, the place where the bullet hangs for an infinitesimal moment, we should be turning our attention to the greenery of the smaller Jardin des Plantes. This botanical garden is in the 5th arrondissement, on the left bank of the Seine. It is towards a patch of ground here, a little outside the Galerie de Paléontologie et d'Anatomie Comparée, that the bullet now moves, gently flipping over to be oriented tip downwards. It travels relatively slowly at first, but accelerates quickly at a little under 9.8 meters per second squared. The moist air once again acts to slightly retard this acceleration, but not enough to avoid the calamity to come. The bullet is only 10 grams of metal, but by the time it reaches its terminal point at the height above ground level of exactly one specific man's head, it will be travelling at something approaching 270 kilometers an hour, or a brisk 74 meters per second. This, plus its elegant design, which tapers to a fine point, concentrates the force it has amassed quite effectively. The tip meets the skin just above the man's parietal bone, suffering very little resistance from the man's thinning middle-aged hair. The bullet burrows in, neatly at first, but then with increasingly chaotic effects. Bits of matter that have never seen sunlight are suddenly exposed. The man himself feels no pain, not exactly, but instead a strange and melancholy lurch of longing for something, as neurotransmitters trigger unconventionally and then go quiet. And so, at a little over a minute after 11 in the morning, on Armistice Day 1918, Corporal Christopher Gibbons of the Australian Corps, who narrowly escaped machine gun fire months earlier at Villers-Bretonneux, slumps to the ground and promptly expires.
Poor Christopher Gibbons. Yeah. So, and in that sense, in some way, he is representative of the Gibbons family, for whom a lot of kind of crappy things happen, but not entirely. But not entirely. There's also a lot of like kind of exciting and joyful things that happen. So first, I want to say, James, thank you for the book. I really enjoyed reading it a lot. It's short and it's kind of the perfect length, I think, for that. And I know you like short books. Maybe we'll talk more about that later. But I also thought it could have been longer, and I don't usually say that. So I wanted to start off by talking with you about place. Partly because we have people from all over the world here on this call, so it's making me think about place. But also because one of the phrases of the subtitle, there's a really long subtitle of the book, is a discontinuous narrative of an Australian family. So some of the parts of the book that I was really enjoying were things that I had to Google. There were specific instances of Australian history and culture and geography. So, I'm just going to give you a couple examples for folks who to remind them, or maybe if they haven't read the book yet, like a pop song from that's repurposed from a 1970s TV show that gets stuck in one character's head. A thing called the Snapshots from Home League program, which was during World War I and right after World War I, where Australian servicemen abroad could get a photo sent to them from home of someone they loved. The Native Police Force in the mid to late 1800s, which was a really eye-opening thing for me to read about. So, and I could go on. There's lots of these things. And yeah, I'm agreeing with this comment. I too like books that make me Google things. So I guess my question is, like, how important to you was it that this is an Australian story? Like, or did you have your eye on kind of some other things, and you were Australian, and so that's just kind of the setting that and that's what you chose? Does that make sense? Like, is there anything quintessentially Australian about this book, or do you reject the idea that there could be something quintessentially Australian? So can you just tell us a little bit about how Australia is working for you in this novel?
Well, I think its Australianness is important. I mean, partly what inspired a lot of it is there is a lot of Australian history that is quite odd. I mean, it's an odd country, and its post-European history is quite a peculiar one. It's a prison that became a country, that became a unified country without any kind of real conflict, but that is built on this background. I mean, you talk about the Native Police Force, which was basically the white colonists who created police forces made up of the indigenous Australian original inhabitants, and then used them to hunt down and destroy their own people. And yes, so it's a country with a very weird and often dark history. But there are a lot of very weird things as well. I mean, I think that's probably true of any country that you look at. But this is the only country I've ever lived in. This is what I know best. So I just wanted to include some of that. And the best way to look at a stretch of history seemed to be doing a family epic, but not in the normal sense that a family epic is written.
Yeah.
I didn't want to write a 500-page book which minutely follows these people through a whole stretch of time. I wanted something that captured the real nature of families, which is that most people, particularly in the West, if they know much about their family, it goes back one or two generations. Beyond that, it's kind of it's a vague blur. Most people know nothing about their great grandparents. At best, maybe where they came from. That's about it. And so I wanted something that all these important things that are very important happen to individual people along their way. Their descendants don't know anything about it, and they're not important to their descendants. They're not. So it's sort of an anti-epic in that sense.
Yeah. That's good. That makes sense. And there's a lot of fun detective work, I think, that readers get to play in terms of like linking these various chapters, these stories, as you call them, together, right? Because you're referencing characters who we've been spending some time with before, who are obliquely kind of referenced in a later one, and we learn a little bit more about what happened to them, maybe, but like that's work that we have to do as readers, right? That's the characters are not really doing that work. Like we know more about those connections in a weird way than they do.
That's it. And as I say, because I wanted each story to work on its own as a story, as well as to add to the kind of whole effect of the book. Yeah, I didn't want you didn't have to know anything about anyone from a previous chapter to see what was happening in this story. But yes, again, if you've read the whole book and that text builds up. I mean, a few people said, "Oh, you should have a family tree at the front," and I was tempted. But books that have family trees at the front are often books where you need to know those relationships. It's
right.
You're flipping back to the front, and I didn't really think that that's important here. As I say, all you need to know for any particular story is the people who are introduced in that story.
Yeah, I mean, I love a family tree myself, but I mean, I think it would work kind of against this. That detective work that I was talking about,
that's it. And a book that you open up that has a big map at the front or that has a family tree at the front, it gives you a vibe of a certain kind of book. And I didn't think this was that sort of book. So,
yeah. No, that makes total sense. Well, I mean, I mentioned detective stories a couple times, or detecting as something that the reader has to do, and that is also something that is deeply woven into as this sort of intertextuality in the book, right? And I wanted to hear some more about the different kind of genres that you've got. Like, there's a lot of things going on. You've got like interview transcripts. You've got this pulp detection fiction that one character is writing. You've got the sort of somewhat more literary novels that another one has written. And we're getting excerpts from all these things. You've got the failed, maybe, graphic novels of a third character, right? It really is reminding me of this one character at the beginning, this doctor who adores what he calls blood and thunder stuff, right? So I guess I wanted to know why you were drawn to incorporate these different kinds of modes in your text, like not just like referring to them, but actually including kind of like, excerpts, right? What did that... I mean, I assume that was really fun. It was fun to write that stuff. I have a feeling it was fun to read it, but like, why the decision to include it as opposed to, say, just referencing it, for example?
I think partly, I mean, it is just as for the writer, it's fun to do. You hope that comes off for the people reading it. I suspect partly it's inspired by something like, for example, it's just been filmed, and I don't know how they're going to make it work, but I'm very interested. Percival Everett's Erasure, and which is not put my book on that sort of level, but I like the fact that most books that I've read in the past that involve a work of art is about, or that is tangential to it, would talk about it, but you never really are exposed to it. Whereas something like Erasure isn't just about a guy who writes a book. You get the whole book that the guy writes. And I thought, I just really enjoyed that. I mean, it's not a book that the guy writes. It's not a great book, but it's not meant to be. It's exactly the sort of book it needs to be for the plot. Erasure, the book itself, is a brilliant book. So I just thought, even including excerpts, because I didn't want to try anyone's patience by including the whole of anything these people write in there. I don't know, books that contain other books I've always liked, books about books, books about books. So to include all of that was good. One thing I didn't do, and I would have liked to have done, but I just don't have the ability, is the graphic novel. Just doing the artwork for that chapter was exhausting. I don't know how anyone does page after page after page. And certainly, if I was to try and create a graphic novel that goes in the book, it involves a young Che Guevara and a young Pol Pot who were both in Paris at the same time, which is the seed of that chapter. I would not be able to make them look the same from frame to frame. So that's what stopped me from trying to include that as part of the actual book itself.
Somebody ought to write that graphic novel, though. It's such a,
it's
a great idea.
Something that occurred to me as a book ages ago, and I thought that would be a good book, but I can't write it. So.
Right. That reminds me of the character who does the sort of like kind of mid-list or maybe even literary fiction novelist who's got that idea for this book that he can't write either because there's too much research that he doesn't know how to do, right? So like, you sort of get a little bit of this Borges thing where you kind of can know the idea of the thing without having the full thing. But it almost feels to me like you're selling yourself a little short there in terms of the drawing, because like, you do draw. I mean, you've illustrated this book, right? Like it is. So that's another thing I want to ask about is like the fascination with visual form in the book, which, you know, takes a couple different forms. Like there's a photographer, right? There's a character who's a photographer, and we have descriptions of the like kind of art catalog descriptions of the photos. We have a painter, we have descriptions of his paintings, which are pretty bad, right? We have the comics, right? We've been talking about, and then also it is illustrated, right? By yourself and by your daughter. So not just, you know, I know that the visual is important to you, and I just want to hear a little bit more about like how that's the case, but also about the decisions to illustrate the book, and you know what that gives us.
I mean, partly it's because I've always quite liked that, you know, when you pick up a sort of 19th century novel and there's a little list of illustrations at the front. I mean, I think it's because I grew up, you know, I think it probably started because I grew up reading like the, you know, the Moomin books and the William books by Rickmal Crompton that were always illustrated. And so they were the kind of bridge between children's books and adult books. And so there's a little person that says, oh, it's just the text. You shouldn't need anything else but the text for a book to be a book. Mm. But the other and winning part is just the part that says, well, it's more fun to have all this stuff. And so Kim, as she was saying earlier, was very kind to let me design myself, which I think caused more pain for her because I was using software that I'm not used to, and so I kept badgering her with questions about how to do it. But it was just a lot of fun to do, and also it was a useful tool in the writing of it because sometimes you're halfway through a chapter and you're absolutely buggered about what to do next. You think, well, I'll just fart around and do some of the artwork for the chapter. Mm. In a couple of cases, I mean, the final chapter of the book, which, you know, the cover is from, the burning down of Sydney Opera House, that just started as a picture first. When I was halfway writing the book and didn't yet know how it was going to end, I was just having fun doing pictures of the Sydney Opera House burning down. And then that just gave me the idea for the final chapter. So it came from that. So it's a mixture of just, it's playing really, just, makes the process more enjoyable.
Right. Well, but I think that's lovely. But and it also comes across in the text too. Like it's very, very fun and enjoyable book and playful book, even though it is also filled with a lot of really, you know, upsetting things, right? I mean, and you know, the chapter that you read with this kind of like sort of super senseless kind of tragic death of someone that's not intentional in any way, like kind of, you know, like seems a sort of encapsulation of sort of the different, like it's absurd, right? It's funny, it's sad, it's like ridiculous, like, you know, you really do have a lot of kind of emotional modes that kind of like are gathered together in the book. So the playfulness does come through. You were talking a second ago about those books you read as a kid that were illustrated. And for me, like, I think of you as just like, first and foremost, like a great reader, you know, like a really wide-ranging reader. Like, what's that?
All I do. So,
well, I mean, it's impressive dedication. Yeah, probably it's all anyone on this call does, right? But like, I mean, just a sort of wide-ranging taste, like, you know, all different kinds of genres and like literature from all over the world, and like really obscure books, even for book Twitter, I would say, but also like totally not self-satisfied about finding those obscure books, you know. So very inspirational to me, I have to say. And so what I want to ask you about is like the relationship between reading and writing for you. So like, you've always been a reader, sounds like, I'm assuming, but based on what you said a minute ago, has being a reader always meant also being a writer, or is that something that happened kind of happenstance? Like, what is the relationship between these two activities for you, reading and writing?
Certainly always involved wanting to be a writer, but there have been big chunks of time of not actually doing any writing. I mean, as Kim was saying, parts of this book were written quite a while ago, but it was only when she looked at it and gave me the kick up the arse to actually take the bits that weren't very good to work on them that it achieved this form. I mean, the original version of this book was probably about twice as long, and start is, yes, very much the same, but a lot of the rest of it got jettisoned and all rewritten or replaced. But between the original version of the book and this version of the book, there was quite a long period of time where the only writing I've been doing has been work related, which has not been terribly exciting writing. So it's the sort of thing that I've always been wanting to do, but have not been very good about actually doing for large stretches of time. I mean, part of that, parenthood gets in the way, life gets in the way.
Sure.
And two, just not knowing if you're actually writing ultimately for an audience or not gets in the way. So, yeah. So certainly from being very young, I had in my head that I was a writer, but it wasn't necessarily true for long stretches of time.
Are there particular titles that of all, thinking back on that wide swath of your reading, are there particular titles that really were in your mind as you're writing this, or that kept coming back to you over the long period of the creation of the text? Particular touchstones, like when I was, this is on the visual mode, but like that character who's the photographer, the descriptions of those photographs, and this is like, 1920s, right? Teens, 20s, etc., right? So it's a long time ago, but those descriptions made me think almost of like, is it Francesca Woodman? Is that her name? I'm not sure if that's the last name. It's a photographer who you introduced me to. So like that, I kind of like was like, it feels like that's in the background there, So were there literary texts that were kind of in the background of the writing
Probably
process?
only in the sense of a lot of them all kind of mixed together and bubbling up. I mean, there are a few things I didn't want to do. I mean, I think I've said this to you before in one of our other discussions talking about Australian literature, and that is that almost every Australian book you'll pick up is about a small town where there's a mystery or a secret. And there are so many more small towns in Australian fiction than there are in real life. Yeah. Everyone in Australia lives in a big coastal city, pretty much. And it's just what we see in our literature is often not at all what most people live. And it's not as though I had any, I guess I wasn't like trying to say that this other stuff is bad, but it's not the mode that I wanted to write. So probably the examples, though there are thousands of books that I love. My house is filled with them. My wife's to spare. When writing was more.
I know the story. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I don't want the book to be like this. I don't want it to be like that. And the only other thing that probably really wanted it to be is ultimately short. I mean, we both agree. Often the shorter the book, the better. And whether I've succeeded or not is another matter. But I always think with a novella, my personal feeling is only poetry can be perfect in that you can have a poem of a discrete length where any word you change will fuck it up. It will just be worse. But once you've got to prose of any kind of length, it has a certain bagginess that means you can make changes and it'll be basically as good or worse or better. You can always fiddle with a bit of prose and there's always leeway. But something short like a poem can be perfect. And I think novellas and short books and short stories are the closest fiction can come to that sort of perfection. And so the idea of writing a short book, whether or not it comes close to that or not, certainly appeals for that reason. I think you've got that condensed purity, if that's the word. That means you can try for that as close as you possibly can if you don't succeed. Whereas a 500-page monster, in the end, you could make changes to that forever and it will not necessarily get appreciably better or worse.
Right. I wonder if that condensed quality, helps with that sense of like pointing outside itself. I mean, that again, there's so many things. One of the things I just really love about this book is the way it's sort of like small, sort of delicate kind of chapters, but like all these kinds of arrows, as it were, sort of pointing, beyond, right, each chapter. And that's part of the detective work of linking it. But there's also, I feel like, suggestions of things that will never quite link up, that sense, the way that like we get a lot of different times in this 150 years or so that's covered, but not all the times, right? Like there's some things that just kind of like get skipped over. Yeah.
Well, that's it. Yeah, it'll sort of each story is 10 or 20 or 25 years after the one before. So there's big gaps. And as I say, a traditional family epic would fill in all those gaps. But I thought, well, you don't need that. Cut it all out.
Right. I wanted to ask you about something that really surprised me about the book, which is how many examples in it you have of like alternate modes of expressing and living gender. Like, I guess if I could put it that way, like, so you've got, for example, women who are pursuing sort of unexpected, unconventional careers, like whether it's the girl who grows up to be a woman who makes glass eyeballs, right? Glass eyes. She takes after her father there, or her sister who becomes this early 20th century photographer who I've mentioned a few times. There's a man in that same time period who like very nervously comes to this photographer and asks to be photographed in these women's clothes that he loves to wear, right? Even at the a way of living that is like really dangerous for him, right? Has caused a lot of harm to him, right? You have the final character in the book in the Sydney scene in like, I guess 2030s Sydney, who's trans, it seems to me. So like when I think of this, just stereotype, I guess. But when I think of Australia, I think of it as kind of rigidly conventional in certain ways, especially in regards to gender. And so do you think that, I mean, you can tell me if they think that's true or not, but like, I guess I was wondering if you felt yourself to be kind of challenging that. So therefore offering a sort of alternate history, as it were, or are you kind of more documentary fashion, kind of like pointing to a sort of counterculture that's like always been there in Australia? Does that make sense as a question?
It does. And I think the answer is broadly the latter. I mean, I think Australia has two strains that rubbed up against each other for a long time. And on one hand, you've got the fact that, yes, it has been, certainly until relatively recently, a culturally quite conservative country, which is why most of the people who, up until probably the 70s, people who were writers or filmmakers, were fucked off elsewhere.
This is like Canada. There's so much like Canada. I mean, yeah.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. And so there is that, but there's also, I guess, a long tradition of, well, I mean, the Australian phrase, she'll be right, mate. Just, let it, to a certain extent, just let other people do their thing. If they're not messing with you, mess with them. I mean, things like, for example, the man who wants to be photographed wearing women's clothes was actually based on, well, a number of things in the book were based on bits from my family history. It was my grandfather, who was in the army in World War II, and he was a translator in Italian POW camps. He spoke some ridiculous quantity of languages and went on to become a translator of poetry from Russian and Ukrainian and Italian and Chinese. Absolutely demented quantity of languages. But when he was in the army, there was a man who was in their unit who sometimes wore women's clothes. And what was odd was, when he talked about it, he was saying that this guy, instead of being victimized the way you would have thought someone, in the army in Australia,
right,
40s, was almost more a kind of unit mascot. He was protected, and he was seen as an oddity, but he was their oddity rather than someone to be picked on. So, in fact, what was presented in the book is worse than history was in this particular case. I mean, I transplanted it 20 years earlier.
Yeah,
but I just thought that was interesting because, I mean, for most people who had tried to live like that, things would have turned out very different. But that there were instances like that, I found that interesting. And I mean, the same with talking about the female characters. Partly, again, that's based on family history. For example, the two women who are cousins and who write crime novels together.
I love them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're based on. There was a writer called Margot Neville, who was an Australian crime writer, who was two women who were, I can't even remember how, they're cousins of some ex removed and some kind, but yeah, of mine and might have been my dad's great aunts. I can't remember now. But yes, they wrote, and they were much better writers than the writing that's in the book attributed to these sisters, to these cousins. Yeah, again, just two women who wrote crime novels under a pseudonym. I always thought that was interesting, and so I had to include that in the book.
Yeah. The whole family, like the name, the Gibbon, right, is this is sort of from the mother's side, right, as it were. Like it's a name that the first, I guess it's the oldest male character, the first male character that we meet, the guy who makes the glass eyeballs, whose daughter then takes over his that profession. Like he has taken his wife's name for, it's kind of, I don't think it's quite clear. Like he's got to get out of he did something shady.
Yeah.
He's but he's got a. It's better to have a different name than the one that he had.
Yes,
so
there's been a medical incident that he's running away from.
Right. Okay. Right. And so he sort of gets his triumphant kind of thing at the end there, where his chapter where he gets to perform an emergency tracheotomy on someone. Right. So
Yeah.
yeah. But like anyway, my point simply here is that like that the title, the name that all these characters then share is comes from the female side. So that seems
That's it. And that's what I like, because I again, for a family epic, I thought it was good if technically no one in the book technically was legally entitled to the name they all have. And also a family epic that finishes with the final character in the book being someone who, as a trans man who hasn't had kids, is unlikely to have kids. So the family gets kind of cut off at that spot as well. So it's things that work against the traditional kind of familyness of a family story.
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of disasters and accidents in this book. There's a train wreck right at the beginning. There's a big flood in late 19th century Brisbane. I don't know if that's real or not. There's the 1974 cyclone in Darwin. That's definitely real. That's another thing that I was Googling and learning all about. There's this atom bomb test that's sort of like, with people's naivete about what is going to incite all kinds of disasters, cancers, etc. Right. And then there's this in this sort of, near future apocalyptic final chapter. There's the burning. I'm not giving anything away. This is, as you said, this is like kind of on the cover and stuff. The burning of the Sydney Opera House. There's that bullet in the chapter that you read, right? So these accidents and disasters that just sort of like litter, the course of the novel. And one thing I noticed about it is like, it's weird. Like, it seems like there's almost always someone who kind of like benefits from these things, like that first Gibbon, taking his wife's name, the guy we just talked about, how he he did this emergency tracheotomy, finally got to do the doctor work that he otherwise was denied in his life. But he's also like they're at the site of this terrible train accident, and these two trains have crashed into each other, and he's like, well, we might sell some more eyes, right? Like he's like, so, and that feels like a kind of like strand throughout the book, like that's like that there's from. Maybe it's even about the colonial history of Australia, right? Of this like this terrible thing that happens to someone means some profit to someone else, right?
That's so that opportunism,
yeah, exactly. So I guess my question is about the end. Like, do you think and it's sort of like, I don't know, speculative, of course, but like, do you imagine that to be true of the final section, or is it really this end is the end, no more? Like, the rest of the book has been so much about like, despite all the crazy shit that happens, things go on, right? This family goes on, history goes on, and they muddle their way through it. And in fact, they thrive in lots of ways, right? But then at the end, my sense is no, but I'm just curious whatever, like what happens after the book is kind of like a silly question, but like what, does this make sense about like what you're thinking at the end here of like finality, how final this last sort of set of this last disaster, is there any circumventing that?
It certainly doesn't feel that way to me. I mean, partly this is what happens when you write a book during the Australian summer, and people in Canada would know the feeling. Just everything's on fire, and that isn't on fire is flooding, and that's now, and this chapter is set 20 odd years in the future. And it doesn't leave you feeling very optimistic. So sort of my feeling of that chapter is the individual character it's about, he'll survive because he's sort of chaotically able to kind of muddle through in the least competent way possible. But he does. But that, more broadly, it's an ending. I mean, there's a final artwork at the very end of the book, which is meant to look sort of like a kind of medieval graving or medieval book illustration, like woodcut illustration of a city in flames. And in my head, that's an illustration, 800 years in the future of whatever comes next might find of people's vague memories of this big disaster, wiping everything out, in the 2040s. So it is a fairly final, finality.
Yeah, I mean, as I was reading that, I was thinking about J.G. Ballard, and like, because some of the tone of your last chapter was sort of had that similar kind of vibe of like, sort of the resourcefulness that people can have amidst apocalypse, but like But the difference seemed to be that in Ballard, it's either apocalypse kind of welcomed or like it's not really apocalypse. It turns out, at least for the protagonist, sort of okay. And that was
sort of unleashes his reptile brain, and he's quite thrilled.
right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's always a dog to grill on the that deck of your highlights or whatever. But this felt more dire than that. So I was curious to get your take on that. Okay, well, enough of me for now. Sean, what do our listeners want to know?
All right. So the first question is from a friend of mine, a fabulous Irish novelist, Covery Madavan, and her question is, and you have partially answered this, but I bet you have more to say, James. Did you plan or outline in advance the book exactly as it's written, or did it evolve? The second question, especially, I'd love to hear you riff on this. Were you surprised yourself?
Yes, very much. It's really nice to hear from Calvary too, because about 20 years ago, I read a book by Calvary called Paddy Indian, and then one of the joys of Twitter is that you read a book by someone, and years later you're chatting with them on Twitter, and you go, "Hang on, I know this person." Yes, the original version of the book was fairly well planned out beforehand, but as I was saying, because after Kim looked at it and made some suggestions about it, what to keep and what needed fixing and what needed placing, it took off in all sorts of new directions then. And so there is a version of the book that's quite carefully planned and about only a quarter as good. So and twice as long. But yes, it's definitely an inferior version. As I say, partly just the more of this final version will just come from ideas that just occurred to me on the spot. I mean, the bullet chapter that I read, I just thought I would try and write a story that was both interesting and had no actual characters, and just see if that was possible. And so that's really the genesis of that. And then the best way of doing that seemed to be, well, what's an inanimate object that you can do that about? And not one of those stories where it's an inanimate object that goes through 6 households and you learn about the households that it goes through along the way. It's just about the object itself and the unfortunate and stupid thing that happens because of it. So yeah, more of the final version is just more fortuitous, I guess, things that came to me along the way. And the same, with the Burning Opera House, it's just a picture that I did and thought, well, I've got a story that can go along with this. That would actually finish the book quite well.
Great. And I wanted to also say that Covery's joining us in the middle of the night from Turkey today. She lives in Ireland, but she had insomnia, so she's here.
Oh, thank you.
The next question comes from a very famous bookish Twitter person, Alina Stefanescu. And lots of people give you congratulations and stuff, so I will let James enjoy reading all the congratulatory stuff, and I'll go right to the question. On the side of other art or multimedia, I thought of Nick Cave and Warren Ellis doing Hand of God, Australian Carnage, at Sydney Opera House recently. Is there any music that influences this book, or any music that helped shape it, or was present during your writing?
Well, certainly Carnage, the album that came from, was one I listened to a lot I listen to music constantly when I'm writing. I drives my wife nuts because she prefers to work in peace and silence, and I need to have music on pretty much all the time. So that particular album very much been listened to a lot during the writing of it. I mean, just I don't know. It's like when people ask you what books you read, you think, well, good ones. I don't know, but just constant music all day, every day, and I don't know how you can live other. If ideally I'm reading and listening to music simultaneously, then you're just kind of maximizing all the good stuff flowing into your head. It means you're not you for that time. And if people make you turn the music off or put the book down, it's all downhill from there. So.
And Ben O'Connell asks, I'm curious, does the family history aspect of the novel indicate any interest in genealogy? If so, did any of your own family stories make their way into the book?
Definitely some did. I mean, as I said, for example, the writers who are cousins under a pseudonym. And there are a lot of some smaller details that were used. In fact, but it's also when you have what you think is a good big idea that you'll use in a book, and you end up jettisoning the entire thing. There was a lot about example, the family being involved in the Australian Communist Party, and there are bits of that left in the book, but it was much stronger in the original version, I think to its detriment. A guy goes off to learn in Moscow about how to be a good communist, things like that in the 30s in the original book, which was, again, all based on my family. A lot of them were, particularly on my dad's side, a lot of them were, members of the Australian Communist Party and quite firm. They had, I had a great aunt who, when she died in the late 80s, had the Internationale sang at her funeral and things like that. And it's stuff that, I found really interesting, but in the end, I couldn't make it work well in the book, like interestingly enough in the book. So there are lots more family. I mean, there's something I was talking about on Twitter the other day. I've got a great grandfather who came here, was born in Jamaica on a plantation. His dad was basically in charge of the plantation. He came here to Australia and ended up becoming a politician in South Australia, which was a separate colony before Australia became a whole country. And he tried to introduce, universal suffrage so that women could vote in the 1850s, and that happened. He tried, I think, 2 or 3 times. It didn't actually happen until the 1890s. And he was the son of a slave woman, and no one knows anything about her. They did a DNA test on my grandmother and found out that she was part, very small part, Ghana genetically. So there's sort of things I wanted to use, for example, like, this half black man who becomes a politician, favouring female suffrage in the 1850s in Australia. But there was no way that I could make it work that didn't seem sort of programmatic or unlikely. I mean, that's the sort of story that doesn't seem like something that would have been likely to happen in the first place. It was very hard to make it convincing in fiction. Pointing it at as something that did happen in real life still didn't mean that I could actually make it work in the book. So there's a lot of stuff like that actually ended up being left out rather than ending up in the final novel.
A name that I very much recognize because I had the Irish novelist Ronan Hession on my channel yesterday, and he said that one of the 2 best books that he read so far this year was by this guy. This is Michael Winkler, the author of Grimish. And he has a couple of questions. The first one is, to what extent is this an Adelaide book? Would it have been different if it was written in a different Australian location?
That's a good question. And I suspect the main thing that makes it an Adelaide book more than anything else is there's no real mention much of Australia as a place with a convict history. Because a lot of Australian historical stuff that's pre-20th century, that's a huge factor, understandably so. But Adelaide is the capital of South Australia. As I said, it's the only colony in Australia that wasn't a convict settlement first. And so, though it's a big part of the story of white Australia, it's not a big part of the story of South Australia. I suspect if I'd grown up elsewhere, maybe that would have been more in my head as a thing to make use of. But the book itself, other than that, I think a couple of bits of the book are set in South Australia, but it's mostly elsewhere. The only really South Australian set stuff are the Maralinga nuclear tests and a chapter about a murder, which was actually, again, based on family history. There was one of my mum's uncles, or great uncles, he and his brother ran a used car yard and fairly inclined to doing predatory money loan schemes if you could buy cars. And there's this guy who had a billion kids, and they were pressuring him for his money that he'd been loaned for a car, and he ended up shooting them. Which, when you read all the court transcripts and things like that, frankly, he had a point. But he was one of the last people hanged in South Australia, and so that made it into the book. Those are probably the only 2 South Australian specific bits of the book. But yeah, I think it's that and the lack of convictness in the stories that makes it probably more Adelaide than anything else.
We've got another question from Michael Winkler, but we'll hold off that for a question from another bookish social media luminary. This question comes from Francis Evangelista, who, among many other fabulously bookish things, is one of the other co-hosts with Dorian for One Bright Book. He is particularly interested in what you guys have been talking about, or we're talking about the merits of condensed literature. And she writes, I think I hear you saying that this is challenging to achieve, that each word, each choice counts for more. Was your initial draft longer and you edited it down, or was your writing process very intentional about making choices as you went along in the process? You've, of course, already talked about this, but I'm sure you have much more to say.
A lot of it was editing down, particularly of the earlier draft of the book, is been edited and edited and edited down. But the more recent stuff I wrote, I tried and keep it compact from the beginning. Even then, all sorts of extraneous crap ends up in there that you find you don't need. I don't know. I guess when I'm doing a first draft, there's always still the temptation to explain stuff so that people don't not get it. It's like having a D.H. Lawrence thing. You can't bear that people don't understand what you're saying, so you have to tell them. But then when you read it back, you need to cut all of that. And so I think whether you think I succeed or not is another matter, but I think I've got better at being more compact from the start as I've gone along. I never would have, when I had the original version of this book, being able to think, well, I can cut half of this and it'll still make sense. But I think it's much better. And I mean, I'm much happier with having written a short book than a long book. I mean, being a novella, being a massive novella person, and I know a number of people here are, but then, it drives other people up the wall. They want more. They want lots of richness and expansion and things like that. But if you can do it in fewer words, and this is not me saying I'm a Hemingway fan, it gives me the fits as well, but I do like, yes, the compact and condensed, purity of something, if you can get it to work.
Michael Winkler's second question is, what was the genesis of the gorgeous Mermaid of Brisbane story?
Oh, that was just because I was reading about the people who did that for real. I think mostly the stuff about them, I think, was English. It was often a seaside attraction, just to have mermaids in the sort of 1880s and 1890s. And I think actually went well into the 20th century. But yeah, just some woman swimming around in a tank with fabric around her legs, and it just seems such an odd thing. Partly because the way you see it, the idea of this illusion of this person who really is a mermaid. Then you look at the old photos that there are of setups, and the tank's these small, dingy things. I mean, it's like peering into a rainwater tank in your backyard with a woman floating around in it pretending to be a fish. The idea of what people found marvelous about it is really hard to get from that, and yet it was this really popular thing, that people were really enthusiastic about. So I just wanted to write about that, and then just looking into all the technicalities of how you do that and don't come up for air, because the moment you surface, breathe, then you are just a wet woman tank. And so they had, tubes running down that they could breathe in from underwater with a cork in it, so you could get some air. Or the worst version, I think I included this in the front of the book, with people who would have pig bladders inflated and filled with air that was sort of anchored to the bottom of the tank, that they could swim down, breathe out of one of those, and then that would give them another few minutes of staying underwater, which sounds an absolutely awful way to work and to entertain other people. But it was interesting, so in it went.
I think this might be one of the last questions. So if anybody else has any questions, we still have time. And I think Dorian might have a few more up his sleeve. Covery asks, what's coming next, James? Anything cooking already?
Only in my head. I was thinking about the course of literature if tuberculosis hadn't existed, and how it would be very, very different. And I'd quite like to do something with that, but I have to actually work on it, and I haven't done that yet. But that's the broad idea. So if someone gets there before me, it's my own fault for not actually sitting down and doing anything. Oh, and also an idea about a guy whose wife gets stolen from him by a superhero, and he has to try and take revenge on someone who is, invulnerable. But I don't think that'll actually be a very good book. But that's also in my head as a thing that could happen.
We have a couple new questions here. Alina Stefanescu asks, I'm now wondering if you've read any of Antoine Volodine, if I'm pronouncing that right, Antoine Volodine's post-exotic novels, or if you have thoughts on them.
I have, and I've only read one, and I've done my usual thing of reading one and then saying, oh, this is great, and buying a pile more, and they're all composting down in the library, and I have to get to them. And then, of course, some new enthusiasm comes along and you repeat as often as necessary or unnecessary. And in retrospect, actually, that's a good point, that might have been part of the, certainly for the later version of the book that got published, the inspiration on that, because I think now that I can see, links in how that was done and how my book was done. The other thing that I'm surprised I didn't end up doing was being one of those people who, having read lots of Thomas Bernhard, goes into full Thomas Bernhard mode, because it's such a hypnotic, when you read too much of it, it's such a hypnotic way of, I don't know, thinking that you kind of feel it infiltrating anything you write. So I'm, in retrospect, kind of surprised that it's not, each chapter isn't a little mad monologue. Because I do like books that are mad monologues by unreliable people. Yet, thinking about it now, I don't think there's any of that in this. So maybe I'll have to do a mad monologue then about without tuberculosis.
Chris Slape asks, I'm interested to know the inspiration for the choice of the family name Gibbons.
I suspect partly it's a funny name, and partly it's probably Beth Gibbons from Portishead, I think. I've known Chris since we were about 8 or 9 or younger. So I think we actually went to a Portishead concert years and years and years ago. Yes, so I think it's nothing more complicated than that. It's an ape, so it's funny, and Beth Gibbons from Portishead. We went to a family thing recently, and someone was telling me about they had an Irish friend whose surname was Gibbons, and she was married to a man whose surname was Shepherd, and the fact that they had not hyphenated the names to be Gibbons Shepherd was just a great sorrow to me. It's been one of the crowning achievements of human civilization. But there you go.
Good. Francis says you should do the mad monologue. I saw that, but I got to say that there are a lot of great mad monologues, and I really loved the third person book. Like I was appreciative of that you used that. So
thank you. It is odd when you look at it and you look at the sorts of books you love to read and the sort of book you end up writing, and you haven't done one that's more like the other. In retrospect, it sort of seems odd not to have done a number of things that I didn't do. That I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah,
I'll stop there because I am gibbering.
Well, it's different from the unconscious and the conscious, I guess, right? Yeah. I'm thinking about the mermaid business again a little bit more, because another thing that strikes me about that chapter is the way that it's connected to this sort of theme of appearances and documenting things and what we can see. Can we see things really or not? And so like the thing that's most striking to me about that chapter is the kind of violence of the end, where the tank gets smashed and stuff, and I don't know exactly what that's about, but like, one way to read that is like kind of this fury at the idea of illusion in some way, and that has me thinking about this opening line of a shelf of eyes polished and unblinking, which is a wonderful line, but like, they're unblinking because they're not real eyes, and so like, they're sort of unseeing in some way, right? Like, so that's from the very first line, it seems like that idea of like, what does it mean to look at something? Can we look at something? This is also coming up in the atomic bomb chapter, right? Like, these guys are all they're really excited about this bomb test because they're going to get to look at it, right? And then of course, like, doing so is going to kill them, right? So they blind them or whatever. It's gonna they have to turn away, or the fascination with X-rays. I don't know. I guess this was a real thing. You go to the shoe store and you can like put your foot in them in a little X-ray machine and see all the bones in your feet, and so like don't have an actual question here. I'm just kind of thinking, riffing here about like, this seems like important to this book, actually, this idea about like what can be seen or not seen. I don't know. Does that resonate for you at all?
It does, and there's a lot of that, and also there's a lot of fakery in the book. The false eyes, the fake mermaid under a fake name, all sorts of things like that.
Right.
And the X-ray machine is something my dad said. They used to go down to the shoe shop and stare at their feet. The X-ray machine just as a treat, because it was fun to do.
Right.
They're radiating their feet, and there was no time limit on it. No one cared.
Yeah.
It seemed such an odd thing. Again, it was weird, but real. It was going in there somehow, shoehorning that in. So yeah.
Well, another kind of disaster in the offing there, I suppose, too, right? So it fits with it. Could you say something about the Ned Kelly bit of the book? Because I thought that was really funny. This sort of like big Australian legend, I guess, in a way that like people outside Australia might also know something about. But in your book, it features pretty obliquely in terms of like a little kid. He's like 8 or something, who's like obsessed with Ned Kelly and his band of brigands or whatever, and insists on being addressed as such, and super charming stuff. And I wasn't sure whether you're wanting us to read this like as a shout out to that sort of like, I don't know, it's sort of a Robin Hood part of Australian culture, maybe. I'm not sure actually, or if you're ironizing it because it's like it's a thing everybody knows about Australia, but in this book it's just like a little kid's game. What were you wanting to do with that aspect?
Partly just a reference to something, that is more known globally. The rest of the stuff, I mean, look, I don't know, but I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that is in there, I mean, like Cyclone Tracy, I don't know how well known that is outside of Australia. I suspect not very. I mean, I suspect most.
I knew nothing about it. No.
And I think a lot of things. I mean, it's like Canada would be the same. It's geographically not, but population-wise, a small country.
Right.
Most of the things that happen there, no one who doesn't live there knows about it.
Yeah.
So, including Ned Kelly is a thing other people do know about it, but even then, as I say, the child who's obsessed with Ned Kelly, his secret favorite is Ben Hall, who's a bushranger who never killed anyone. And so, which I think was probably something that I was when I was a kid. I thought Ben Hall was good bushranger, so he committed all the crimes. He didn't murder anyone, so he was a bit more okay to like. Does that make sense? Ned Kelly is more interesting now, I think, because when you're a kid, you just told, he was this guy who robbed lots of people and wore the cool armor and then got caught. But then, particularly recently, I mean, he's been written about in several different novels and films, things, and you realize how much more of a complex character he was. It's not just, I mean, he was a murderer and he was a thief, but he was also a victim of police corruption and something of a Republican Irish nationalist who wrote, quite a powerful little letter which became the source of the Peter Carey novel about him. And so he was an interesting character, but as I say, I wanted to include that as one bit of Australianness that other people might have heard of.
You were talking about in response to Francis' question, we talked about it earlier about, short books, about novellas. Seems like do you want to plug you and Brad's gig next year?
Yeah, I should do that.
It feels like
next
a
year,
nice chance to let people know if they don't.
Yeah, next year, Brad Bigelow, who a lot of you would know, runs the Neglected Books site and he's the Neglected Book Twitter account. He just unearths all these amazing books that are out of print, and also is now bringing a number of them back into print, going above and beyond. But yes, we're just doing a monthly online discussion about novellas. So we've just chosen 12 novellas from around the world, different eras, different original languages. And just once a month, we'll do an online discussion about it. He's handling all the technical side of it because I have no idea what I'm doing. And I'll just do this kind of unfocused rambling. And we'll just talk about it with whoever shows up. And it should be good.
It must have been super fun to choose those books. Like,
I had a much longer list, and I was forced to lose a lot of Austro-Hungarians who were on my original list. But I with mostly good grace, I agreed.
When it becomes a monster hit, you can do a full Austro-Hungarian year.
That's right. We'll just do a year of Joseph Roth or something.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't like that. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, what could be better?
Well, the last thing that I have to ask is I mean, it's something that we kind of, I wanted to loop back a little bit to the opening question I had about like Australianness and stuff, and a lot of things that just came out in your thoughts on the Ned Kelly, but have come out in glancingly in other parts of your responses, like just ways of kind of just as you did such a neat job in this book, I think, of like fascinating work of like giving the alternate kind of a different side of those gender stereotypes that we might have, for example. So too other elements of like Australian history. So the thing you mentioned about the convicts, which I did not know, was really interesting, but it is addressed in the novel, right? Where someone's like, I forget who in which chapter, but like, oh, the family did they come here as convicts or something? And like, no, actually is the response, right? Like, so deliberately placing your characters kind of to the side of that one particular kind of narrative, Australian history. And then I was thinking about the character of May, who I found really interesting and kind of wanted more of, like, and her reflections on like, she's written something, and then the publisher's like, wouldn't you, it would really be great if you wrote like a book about kind of like clash between your Australian and Asian heritages. I think that, I think the public, i.e. the white settler public, would like eat that up. And she's like, I don't know if she says this or it's just in her mind, but like, family's been here for like X number of generations, like, so the way that's a kind of undercutting of a certain white settler kind of story about Australia. So how much was those sort of challenges to the established idea of Australianness on your mind?
It was definitely there, and in some ways I would have liked to have done more of that. I mean, I don't have, for example, Australia has almost as long as, Europeans have been here. Yes, Chinese people have been here and Afghan people. So, there's a lot of, people who have got, for example, mixed Indigenous and Afghan history and are Muslims in Australia. And they can trace the non-Indigenous side of their family back 150 years. It's really interesting because, again, that gets neglected. There's an artist who's basically been going around all over Australia, putting up these big posters on the outsides of buildings that have these vintage photos of Afghan men and Chinese men and things like that. And it's just Aussie in huge letters about it, just kind of reminding people and showing these fascinating glimpses of people who've been here all along, as long as the rest of the non-Indigenous people have been here, but are always left out of them.
Right.
And so I wanted to include that and nod to it. And in some ways, I hope it's not tokenistic, but it is in the end only a nod, because partly that's not my story that I'm comfortable doing enough to tell, because I don't want to get it wrong. But those stories are definitely there, and I would certainly love to see more of them. And there are a lot of people of Asian background who are finally being published in Australia, but very few of any kind of Middle Eastern ancestors being published. And so, all of that's a part of it. Australia now is a very multicultural society, but for a long time, there was this White Australia policy, which was deliberately designed. You could migrate to Australia if you could answer a test in a language that wasn't your own, but it was always rigged so that, they wouldn't give you the test in English. If you spoke English, they could give you a test in like an Albanian if they wanted to, if that would keep you out. And so until relatively recently, this was all part of deliberate attempt to make Australia a white place, despite who was there first.
Right.
So I definitely wanted to include that, but as I say, it's nowhere near as much of it as there probably should be. But I also didn't want to include it and fuck it up. So that's
yeah. Oh, I totally hear that. The Afghani thing is fascinating to me. I had no idea.
Australia is full of camels in the outback, for example, because Afghan people were brought out here to help people who are exploring and trying to get from one side of the continent to the other, and they would have just all died. So Afghan cameleers came out here and bought camels, and sort of on their expertise that all the exploring and traveling from the east coast was done, a lot of it. And now the camels have gone feral and they live there, and the descendants of the people live here, and it's all neglected aspect of the country's history.
So that's something else that I learned, and I just learned a shitload of stuff reading this book, and it's not like that's not the main reason to read it. I guess it's sort of like for facts like that, but it gives, I think, hopefully to all of you here in the audience, a sort of sense of the richness of James's book. It's a really, despite all this talk about how short it is, it's the condensedness, and that, you know, the density of it is its richness. It's where it's which its richness arises. And so I really recommend Gibbons to all of you. It's good stuff. So thanks for giving us a chance to fet you, James, and to chat.
So yeah, that's it, guys. This was fabulous. I just got my copy in the mail a couple of days ago, so I haven't read it yet. I'm sure looking forward to reading it. And on behalf of James Morrison, Dorian Stuber, and Kim Paulsat, thanks everybody for coming.